distinguished guests, colleagues, alumni, students, friends, ladies and gentlemen. The honorable guest that we have with us today once said that in the new economy, information, education, and motivation are everything. Having access to information and being able to critically assess it, acquiring the knowledge and skills necessary to apply yourself professionally, having the incentive and the inspiration to work towards a goal are all part of a European university's vision for the future. It is therefore an honor and a great pleasure to welcome Bill Clinton, former President of the United States and Honorary Chancellor of Laureate International Universities, to Cyprus and to EUC. President Bill Clinton has always been committed to knowledge and learning. From his early studies at Georgetown University, Oxford University, and Yale Law School, to becoming a law professor at the University of Arkansas, he went on to bring about one of the most successful educational reforms as governor of Arkansas. As President of the United States for 2 consecutive terms from 1993 to 2001, he presided over the longest period of prosperity and economic expansion in American history. Policies implemented during his presidency resulted in the biggest investment in education in the US in 30 years. In April 2010, he accepted the role of Honorary Chancellor of Laureate International Universities, advising this global network of private universities, of which EUC is a member, on issues pertaining to social responsibility, youth leadership, and increasing access to higher education. After leaving office, he founded the William J. Clinton Foundation to promote and address international causes such as prevention of AIDS and global warming. In 2009, he was named United Nations Special Envoy to Haiti, and following the 2010 Haiti earthquake, US President Barack Obama announced a joint effort between Bill Clinton and George W. Bush to raise funds for victims of the earthquake. Moreover, he will be actively taking part in the Greek-American campaign aimed at reversing the negative image of Greece and at promoting initiatives that could contribute toward tackling the repercussions of the crisis. He is the author of 4 books, the latest of which, titled Back to Work, Why We Need Smart Government for a Strong Economy, tackles one of the most prominent current global issues, that of the global economic crisis. Considering social and political circumstances, the global economic climate, as well as the purpose of President Clinton's visit here today, I feel it is important to say something about the location of this event. Cyprus is a small country, but one which has emerged stronger, both from its colonial past and the troubled history which led to the division of the island. Our own university is the culmination of an education vision conceived 50 years ago when the Republic of Cyprus was in its infancy. Standing here today, representing European University Cyprus, I feel that it is a testament to the power of visions and visionaries. And in times of great difficulty, having a vision is the driving force for a successful future. Education and the promotion of education is for that reason even more necessary during these times, because it does not only offer people a vision, it can also cultivate and hone skills, create expertise, and form the individuals who will be adequately equipped to face the challenges posed by the current situation. I am therefore inclined to agree with you, Mr. President, in the new order of things, information, education, and motivation are everything. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome President Bill Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Elifiades. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank the students, the faculty, the administration, the citizens of Cyprus who are here, and I am very glad to be here. I, as you might imagine, spent a great deal of time dealing with issues related to Cyprus when I was president, and I supported the entry of Cyprus into the European Union, and but I'm here today because I serve as the honorary chancellor of the laureate universities. And this is, I believe, the 13th campus where I have addressed the students and others supporting this network. If you think about how laureate works, it is a metaphor. It is symbolic of what is working in the modern world. This is an international network of universities. You have students here from more than 30 countries, but you are connected through the internet to the campuses all over the world. When I spoke at the Laureate University in Malaysia, they actually carried it over the internet at many of the other campuses around the world, people who may have never thought about the challenges of Malaysia and what the people felt there. So the first point I want to make, which is also the last point I will make, is that the future, I believe, belongs to those who participate in networks of creative cooperation, who learn together, who grow together, who test ideas together, who make mistakes together and change and do something else. The modern world is the most interdependent age in human history, primarily because of information technology. But interdependence is a word which does not guarantee a positive outcome. Think about it. If you are interdependent, it simply means that you cannot escape other people. But the interdependence can be positive or negative or both. In the case of the laureate system, I think it's very good. You can go to any of these universities anywhere in the world and get a high-quality education. You can learn things which will enable you to live your dreams, fulfill your talents, and find a job and make a good living, establish a family, and make a future. In part, because the university has high standards, in part because you bring students here from many other countries, and when you open your medical school next year, presumably you'll have even more representatives from other countries as well as Cyprus. And in part because every day the whole model favors working together. The interdependent world we live in today, as we all know, is not perfect. And there are three very profound limits on the world working as it should. I believe a world of completely positive interdependence would be one where we share opportunities, we share prosperity, and when there are problems, we share responsibility for solving them. I believe a positively interdependent world would allow us to be proud of what is different about ourselves, our ethnic differences, our racial differences, our religious differences, but would say we can still be in communities with people who are different from us because our common humanity matters more. Interestingly enough, this is biologically true. When I was president, I spent a great deal of American tax money, $3 billion to be exact, to finish the sequencing of the human genome. We did it in an environment of interdependence. We had European scientists, we had Latin American scientists, we had Japanese scientists. We were all working together. We also had a private entity working on the same thing, and finally we decided to join hands. And the human genome was sequenced. It's had already an enormous number of positive effects. When you establish the medical school here, and young people get their degrees and then they go into the hospital and they start to deal with problems, you will now be able to deal with the latest discoveries in the human genome and their practical impact wherever you are. For example, we have already identified the 2 genetic variances that put young women at high risk of breast cancer. It won't, within 10 years, I believe virtually no one will die of breast cancer that has access to early treatment and diagnosis. I was just at the largest hospital in the United States, private hospital dealing with child cancers, founded by a great Lebanese American, Danny Thomas, the St. Jude Hospital. They discovered that there were genetic differences in children with the same kind of cancers, which meant that if you took the medicine that our government had approved that guaranteed almost 100% survival of a form of child breast cancer, a brain cancer, if you had the genetic variants, it would kill you because it would poison your system. But if you took half the size, you would get well because you didn't need that much medicine. So today, all the time, they do the genetic test. This group gets the full medicine, this group gets the half medicine, almost everyone survives. You will be a part of that global network of sharing. But the most important thing we have learned in the human genome is this. For every person on Earth, not 100% descendant from sub-Saharan Africa, which is all of us, right? 1 to 4% of our genome comes from the Neanderthals, our pre-human ancestors. Notwithstanding that, we are all genetically 99.5% the same. That is, if you look around this room today, every difference you can see, alas, not related to age, I have found there's no cure for that. Every other difference you can see, in your height, your body shape, your hair color, or having hair or not, your eye color, the color of your skin, everything you can see is lodged in 0.5% of your biological makeup. Now it's interesting, pick up the newspaper in any country on any given day, and almost all the stories are about the 0.5% of us that is different. Almost all of us spend 99.5% of our time thinking about the 0.5% of us that is different. I wish I were a little taller. I'd like to be a little thinner. I would really like to be a little smarter. Think about it. All of our patterns are organized to get us to think and focus on what is different. And that's good. It makes life interesting. It makes problem solving better. But it means we should be working together more because we're 99.5% the same. So what are the things that are holding us back? I think, broadly speaking, besides our attitude, there are 3. One is the world is too unequal in terms of incomes and access to employment, education, and healthcare and capital for us to make the most of this modern world. Half the world's people still live on $2 a day, US or less. 1 billion people have no access to clean water. 1 billion people go to bed hungry every night. 100 million children never go to any school at all, and at least 100 million more go to school without trained teachers or learning materials. Lots of other things. You know these numbers. Within most countries, including advanced countries, inequality has increased in the last 10 years. I'll say more about that in a minute. But if you have a great amount of inequality, it is a huge limitation on the ability of the economy to grow and to create an opportunity for shared prosperity and shared opportunities. We probably all believe in some inequality. We believe people who work extra hard should be rewarded. We believe people who have a great new idea that can provide opportunities for sometimes millions of other people should be rewarded. But if there is too much of this, it's like putting a great fence around the possibilities of the human race. The second thing is there is too much instability. Market economies depend on some instability. If there were no instability in human society, we would basically be static. We wouldn't move. We wouldn't grow. We wouldn't change. But if there is too much instability, witness the current financial crisis, what's happened in your neighbor Greece, the impact it's had on Cyprus and the economy. If there is too much instability, things shut down. People become afraid. And it has the exact same impact in the end as if there's no instability. Things freeze up. You can see the major sources of instability in the financial crisis, which I should apologize to all of you since it began in the United States, spread quickly to Europe, beginning in the UK and Ireland, and then found its way around the world. So we need a world with some instability, but if there are not limits on it, it's a tremendous constriction on growth. Cyprus is living with it today. You had nothing whatever to do with the global financial crisis, but it has affected your potential to grow. And when it does, it makes people feel less secure, and then they are less able to solve other problems. The third real problem the world has is climate change, global warming, which is now already a big limitation on the world's ability to grow and will get worse. We now in the United States are going through an unprecedented heat wave. It has affected 60% of our corn crop. We produce more corn than any other country on earth, and we ship it around the world. We could have a new round of food riots within 6 months if the world's crops continue to burn up in the fields. Even more important, the ice cap on Greenland is melting. That's 8% of all the fresh water on Earth is lodged on one island. Oh, it's a big island, all right, but it's a long way from here. If it all flows into the North Atlantic, it could block the Gulf Stream, which keeps Northern Europe warm enough to live in the wintertime. Think about who lives in Northern Europe. The Danes, the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Finns, the people in the north of Germany, in Canada, in the north of Canada, in the northernmost part of the United States. Some of the most productive economies on earth that help all the rest of us lift up could be shut down for months at a time because it could be as cold as it was 700 years ago. Meanwhile, the oceans will be rising. A few years ago, I worked for the United Nations for 2 years to help the countries affected by the tsunami. And I fell in love with the small country of the Maldives, 1,300 islands in the middle of the South Pacific. Most people lived on about 100. We got them to move to 13 so we could build them up a little bit. But they really expect within 50 years their country will be gone and they will all have to leave. So what does that say? If you're older and your blood gets thin, I can tell you this, even though it's very hot in Cyprus today, I like it. Cold bothers me more than warm as I get older. But it's like everything else. If too much of a good thing is a disaster. And we have got to do something about this. And we need to think about that. So, to back up, if we want to create a world of positive interdependence, if we want to value what is different about ourselves, our families, the groups of which we're a part, but still live in a world of positive interdependence where we share the opportunities, we share the responsibilities, and we feel that we're part of larger communities as well as our own, then the number one question of the 21st century, I think, is how do we do that? How do you build up the positive forces of interdependence represented by you and the Laureate Network? How do you reduce the negative ones? And how do you do it in a way that brings people together instead of driving them apart? I've been very interested in following all the troubles of all the countries, including mine, in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And I've given a lot of thought to this. I was in political life in America for 30 years, and I loved it. I like politics. I like people, I like policies, and I like politics. But most of the time, every day's political story was about two things. What are you going to do, and how much money are you going to spend on it? Right? Look at what Greece is dealing with. You got to cut the budget another $13 billion. It's all about money. What are you going to do, and how much money are you going to spend or not spend? Should America cut taxes more or invest more in education and training? There was almost no discussion of the third question, which is whatever you are going to do, and however much money you have or do not have, how do you propose to do it so that your good intentions are turned into real change? I think the generation of students here have to begin to think of themselves as a how generation. How are you going to do things? Because we will go through ups and downs. There will be times of plenty of money and times when there aren't many. But there is always an opportunity every single day to answer the how question. Now, you should think about this based on your own experience. But my experience is that the answer to those questions, all those how questions, take very different form in the poorest countries that are developing economies and the long, prosperous countries. In poor countries, the question is, how do you build systems that reward hard work and ability and responsible conduct so there are positive consequences? If you look at the really poorest places on earth, they don't have systems. I just came from a trip to Africa, which I take regularly to look at my projects there in healthcare and economics and education and other things. I was in South Africa and in Mozambique and in Rwanda and Uganda. Every place I was thinking about how we could help them to achieve a better result. In South Africa, we helped them rewrite all the contracts for AIDS drugs. South Africa has the biggest AIDS problem in the world. And they were paying way too much for medicine. They saved $700 million in 2 years because we rewrote the drug contracts. They took all the money and put it into care and added more than 400,000 people to the ranks of those getting care, the biggest increase in the shortest amount of time ever. There was no more money, we just had a better answer to the how question. In Mozambique, we helped them, a much poorer country, to provide tests that require blood and give the results in 15 minutes. Big deal. If everyone lives a long way away, no one has a car, how many times can they walk 10 miles to a clinic? How many times will you get to provide treatment to someone? No more money, just spent differently to answer a how question. In Rwanda, we celebrated the opening of a soybean oil plant that will add to the value of the farm dollar there. Big deal if you want, and Rwanda is the most densely populated country in Africa because the landmass is small and 90% of the people still live in rural areas. Most people believe that small farmers will not make it in the modern world. If so, it's big trouble for Africa because there's no way they can generate enough jobs in the cities for them. So I, coming from a farming area, and when I was a boy living in a society with a lot of small farms, have spent a lot of time in the last few years trying to figure out how small farmers could be as productive and profitable as big farms are, so we don't have to tear up the living patterns of poor people in poor countries around the world. So we're processing the soybeans in a poor country and adding to the farmers' incomes. We're roasting the coffee in Rwanda and adding to the farmers' incomes. They're making twice the fair trade profit for coffee. And in Uganda yesterday, we visited one of our partners who's building a network of schools because Uganda still doesn't have universal enrollment in elementary schools, in the primary schools, because 6- and 7-year-old children won't walk 10 kilometers to school, but they'll all walk 2 kilometers to school, and most will walk 5 kilometers to school. So a young American who was sent on an internship to Uganda fell in love with the country and said, we can build these schools much cheaper. I'll let the community build the schools. And in a year, he's built 14 schools, a 28-year-old man, for 1/4 what the government was paying to build the schools. Soon there will be 60, and I hope soon 600. And we had a meeting, and 500 people showed up in the middle of nowhere in Uganda because they built the school with their own hands. And the government pays for the teachers, and the children are being educated. There was no more money. We just tried to answer the how question. Now, once a country has been fairly well developed for a long time, the problems are just the reverse. They all have systems. We all have systems. Think of the systems we're taking for granted today. You would be surprised if the lights went out, if the microphone did not work, if the air conditioning failed even though it's over 100 degrees outside. Most of the time I spend in Africa in places they can't take any of that for granted. In Haiti, where I work for the United Nations today, the microphone failed on the president of Haiti while he was making his inaugural address. And no one was surprised because they don't have a national electrical system. But it has nothing to do with the people of Haiti. In the U.S., we have a big Haitian diaspora. They are less than 2% of our African population. They are 11% of our African-American doctors. They're incredibly gifted people. They don't have any systems. So I'm building them systems. But if you look at what happened in the U.S. and all these other countries that have had trouble, we have systems, but if you go back to the beginning of civilization, go back to the Sumerians, you find at some point all successful civilizations are threatened by their own systems because they become too reluctant to change. The people running the systems are more interested in holding on to the present than creating the future, in maintaining their positions than advancing the purpose for which the institutions were set up. This is not just a criticism of government, it's also true in the private sector. And it's human nature. None of us like to give up what we have or put it at risk, or even to change after you reach a certain age. When I was in American politics, we had a saying that made the point where one person would look at another and say, "Let's change. You go first." Right? We're all like that. So what the developed world has to do is to figure out a new model of growth that doesn't have so much financial risk and then run all this financial downside and ask ordinary people to bear the whole burden of mistakes that they didn't make. And sometimes, if a government takes on, for example, obligations in pensions and retirement that it knows it can't pay for, then that's just as bad as not treating people well and fairly, because you're making a promise that can't be fulfilled. So in the long-established countries, what we have to do is to reform our systems while we help developing countries build theirs. But there's a fair and an unfair way to do it. In the last 30 years or so, I believe the world has been limited by the rise of finance at the expense of manufacturing and services and a more balanced economy. One of the things that got America in trouble was that people were making money by betting on what was going to happen in the mortgage market or betting on what was going to happen in another market. And no matter how the bet came out, no new jobs would be created, no new businesses would be formed. The only thing that could happen to ordinary Americans is they would lose because a lot of money would change hands and the system would be more fragile. So what we have to do is to recover balance. Finance is a good thing. Giving loans and charging a reasonable interest rate is a good thing. You want people to take risk, but banks and others who loan money or invest it should have the capital on hand appropriate to the risk taken. Because otherwise, if it fails, ordinary people bear the burden. So we are in the process of trying to rebalance our economic systems in a way that has positive impacts, where there are opportunities for more broadly shared prosperity, not more income and employment inequality, where there are opportunities for risk-taking in an appropriate way to create new jobs and new areas of economic activity, but where you're not just throwing money out the window with no idea of what the consequence will be on ordinary people if all these bets go bad at the same time, which is what happened, as we all know, in many places. The details are different in different places. Every country has to have some sort of reliable tax system. That was one of the problems with Greece. In Spain, they had a reliable tax system and a budget surplus. They got in trouble because the banks made too many housing loans at high risk without enough capital to cover the risks if they went bad. America had a combination of those things and other problems. But if you get back to the basics, what you always find is that you need some instability, but not too much. You need to reward people who make special contributions without too much inequality. And if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. There is no substitute for the effort that you are making to get an education and to learn. No substitute for having a system that rewards work and good ideas. So we are going through this period of change. Now, I think for the developed and the developing world, the threat of climate change is the answer to the economic malaise. There is almost nothing which would do more to create more jobs than changing the way we produce and consume energy. And lucky enough, you just found all this natural gas, or you think you will. Natural gas is much better to use for energy than coal and oil, and provides a bridge to a future where we are all more self-sufficient. I was just in probably the greenest economy on earth in Costa Rica, where there's also a laureate university. Costa Rica is a small country in Central America in a region long troubled by civil wars and conflicts, narco-trafficking, corruption, and violence. They have no army. 26% of the land is in national parks. 51% of the land is forests. 92% of the electricity is generated from hydroelectric power. They have a dormant volcano that will give them all the geothermal energy they will ever need. They do import $1 billion worth of oil in the form of gasoline to run their cars. So the president of Costa Rica asked me to get them an electric car company, and she said, we have a school in every community, a healthcare system in every community. We will put recharging facilities, and we'll be the first country in the world to run on electric cars. Then we won't need any carbon. We'll be a zero carbon country. Their per capita income is twice the average of their region already. I was thinking about that walking around here today. It's hot. And as I told you, I like that. If I were trying to chart the future economy of Cyprus and bring more tourists in here and try to cast the net wider because of the economic challenges in the Mediterranean, I would say get the gas and use it efficiently, sell what you can, use much more solar power than you have, and since this was a great seafaring nation, examine what the possibilities in wind and tidal energy are, which I know there is some study going on now. But meanwhile, if you painted every roof on this island white, you would immediately reduce by 20% the heat going into the buildings. You could put all the young people who aren't in university to work for several months just going around painting the roofs white. We did that in New York City where we did this. The investment paid for itself in 3 months, after which it was pure profit and lower electric bills. It's also a gift to the electric company because you're giving them back power, which they can then use without charging more to attract new industries, new businesses, finance new hotels, do whatever has to be done. So I'm quite optimistic. Another thing that, if you care about this, that's interesting is the most important scientific finding of the last year related to climate change is this. Non-carbon greenhouse gases, principally methane, black carbon from poor people burning charcoals to cook their dinner, and the hydrofluorocarbons and the chlorofluorocarbons, which are principally generated by window air conditioners in newly prosperous areas of India and China. If you dramatically reduce the emissions from them, it would slow the rate of global warming by half. And in the northern part of the world, where the North Pole is melting and the ice is falling off of Greenland, it would slow the rate of warming by 2/3. Why? Because carbon stays in the air longer than methane and these other gases. So I'm trying to get every big city in the world that I work in, and that's a lot, to close all their landfills, to recycle the plastic, the metal, the glass, and turn the rest into fuel for steam heat for factories, or if they have enough waste, to generate electricity. Sao Paulo, Brazil, which has 24 million people, a few more than Cyprus, has already, at the site of their two biggest landfills, huge electrical generators. They are cleaning up the land. They're giving it back to the people, where they can have houses with room, where they can have schools, where they can have playgrounds, and it's money. Instead of waste, it's an investment in the future. So my answer to the how question, how do you reduce inequality and instability, besides making the obvious changes? How do you have something to look forward to in the morning besides reading one more lousy story about all the cuts people have to make everywhere to pay people off who no longer have confidence in your ability to cover your debts? It's create a new economy, change the way you produce and consume energy. It will change everything. Use less and change the source of what you do use. It would create unlimited amounts of jobs around the world and promote equality and political stability by making people less dependent on other countries for their base energy sources. You may think I'm wrong about that, but I spend a lot of my life doing it. And so far, I haven't worked anywhere where it wasn't good economics. So, in summary, we live in an interdependent world. There are limits on your future in spite of your being part of the Laureate Network because of too much inequality, too much instability, and climate change. We should use solving the climate change problem to reduce the negative inequality and instability. Before all that, we have to make a decision whether we're going to share the future or fight over it. So I will close with this story, appropriate since I'm here. There's another network of private universities that are only business schools called the HULT Network, H-U-L-T. They are a part, as is the Laureate Network, of the Clinton Global Initiative, which we convene every year at the opening of the United Nations. We invite all the leaders of all the countries to come, plus business leaders and philanthropists and non-governmental organizations, including NGOs from very poor places where we pay their costs to come to New York to meet with other people, and we ask everyone to make a commitment to do something, to solve a problem. And we put together creative networks of cooperation. So the commitment made by the Hult Business School Network was this. They would offer a cash prize every year going forward for business schools and economic departments all over the world to present case studies solving the problems we were dealing with. So, for example, this year, they offered 3 prizes. They said, and by the way, anybody, you can enter. Any university in the world can enter this contest, not just theirs. So here were the questions for this year. Number 1, Habitat for Humanity has a great way of helping people to build their own houses, but they require volunteers from Habitat. So it's a constraint on growth. How would you use their model to build 20 million houses in a year? Problem 2. One of the ways that very poor places can overcome their lack of access to information is to hook up to the internet in schools in remote areas. And there's this One Laptop per Child initiative, which some of you may be familiar with. And they said, this is a great idea, but they're doing like $500,000 a year. How could you do 20 million a year so you could actually solve the problem in 5 years? Problem number 3. Solar panels are very cheap now because of these massive Chinese subsidies and because of the public-private investment the U.S. made. The price dropped 50% in 1 year, and for the first time in my adult lifetime, solar power became cheaper than wind power. And there are whole villages in India and Africa, and increasingly places in Haiti where I work, that are using this. We just finished a hospital there in Haiti that has 1,800 solar panels and gives the surplus electricity to the electrical grid. It is the largest solar building in all the Caribbean, in the poorest country. But they said, this is all very nice, you tell these stories, but how could you put up 20 million in a year so you could really make a difference? Here's the point. The winning team on the solar problem was from New York University. I should make full disclosure, my daughter works there. But it was not New York University in New York. It was their campus in Abu Dhabi, which, like you, has students from many countries. Nobody from the Gulf was on the winning team. The winning team was, think about your own experience, the winning team were 4 students, 1 from China and 1 from Taiwan, 1 from India and 1 from Pakistan. There are countries at each other's throats for decades. You put them in a place where they can focus on the future instead of the past, and they were young and techno-savvy and into the problem and so over what their elders were still so into. And they were up there, and so when I brought them up, I said, are you sure you want this picture in your local newspaper? And they were laughing. They said, yeah, we're over this. We have to create the future, and we have to create it together. So think about that. That's more important. I may be right or wrong about the specifics of what I think should be done, but I am sure I am right that the future will belong to those who choose creative cooperation over constant conflict. Thank you very much.
Three of our students have submitted questions that they would like to ask of you. So if I may, I'll read the questions for you, okay? The first student is George Tofa, an MBA student. Is George here? Thank you, George. Stand up, okay? I'll read his question. Here in Cyprus, we see unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment, to be on the rise. How far do you think youth unemployment is a matter that should worry global leaders? And why is not enough attention paid to this problem?
Well, first of all, it's a huge problem everywhere. One of the reasons that the Tahrir Square demonstrations occurred and brought down the Mubarak regime was that the Egyptians, through good times and bad, maintained their university network, but they were producing 400,000 university graduates a year and nowhere near 400,000 jobs. And it's a complicated question. In Africa, I don't know if I said this when I was talking about Uganda, but one of the things that bothers me about Uganda is, in spite of all the progress they have made, they have the second fastest, highest birth rate in the world. The average family still produces 7 children. So if they keep doing this, there is no way the youth unemployment problem can be solved, because the economy will not produce enough jobs. In South Africa, one of the projects I visited I did not mention is trying to deal with this in an interesting way. About 10 years ago, when Nelson Mandela was still active, I'll just give you this as an example. When Mandela was still active and had just left office, he called and he said, okay, you and I are out of office, so we have to become part of the NGO world. And South Africa needs a strong civil society, which I believe. I didn't talk about that today, but there are always going to be gaps in what the government can provide, and what the private sector will produce. And you need NGOs to come up with clever ways to fill the gap, in this case, the youth unemployment gap. So Mandela said, come over here, we'll have a big meeting about civil society. And I brought with me a number of American social entrepreneurs, and we started in South Africa a program called City Year, which is the largest of the volunteer programs that were part of my youth service initiative in America. Now here's the point. There are 120 of these kids who work with, or now 150 a year. They work with 20 times that many South African students in schools, and they get trained for the economy. The unemployment rate among people under 25 in South Africa is over 40%. We place 80% of our people after a year in this program because the employers know that there's almost no risk of hiring them, that they're highly productive, that they're deeply devoted to their work, they'll show up on time, and they'll learn to do whatever has to be done. So I think you have to ask, there are really 3 questions here behind yours, if you want to really tackle youth unemployment. One is you have to ask yourself, how many young people are moving into the workforce every year? And is there any way that any economy could produce it? That is, if it would take 15% growth to create enough jobs to hire every young person moving into the workforce, you need to look for another solution. You need to ask yourself, are all the women being educated? Do all the women have access to the workforce? That's the only thing in the world that crosses every culture and every religion in reducing the birth rate. In every society, without regard to what they think about contraception or anything else, what reduces the birth rate and stabilizes population is putting all the girls in school and giving all the young women access to the workforce. So first you have to ask that. Second, you have to ask yourself, and this is what I suspect is the most important thing in Cyprus, how can we not only restore economic growth, but how can we do it in areas that are labor intensive so we can hire young people at all different skill levels? For example, I believe, again, if you carry through on these preliminary discussions that show you could generate electricity from wave energy, And then you brought in the Dutch and other people who built all these buildings that basically used no carbon energy at all, and remade Cyprus as the green capital of the Mediterranean, I think you'd have twice as many tourists as you do. Because then they could go back to the past and think about the future. It's hardly any place that's got a richer history, but you'd be creating a future. Tourism is highly labor intensive, so you could create more jobs. Some tourist jobs require you to have a university degree to run a hotel or manage a restaurant. Some just require you to show up on time and know how to deal with people. And I would think about other sectors of the economy. Some of this will be cured too, by the way, as we pull out of this miserable economy. I took a long walk through the old section of Nicosia today, and I saw a lot of empty storefronts. They'll fill up again when, you know, growth comes back to Greece and other things happen. In other words, the current moment is not necessarily reflective of where you're going to be forever. So, but you need to think about part of your economic strategy needs to be trying to generate growth in some sectors of the economy that are labor intensive, where you can't export the jobs, and it's not like a factory where you'll be able to produce more and more things every year with fewer and fewer people. Manufacturing is good for a nation to have, but it is always the most productive part of the economy. That's what makes it attractive. It can pay better wages, but it means every year you can produce more things with the same or fewer people. So you need some labor-intensive growth. And then the third thing you have to ask yourself is, take the ideal map of a Cyprus economy. Right? What would it look like? How many jobs would be required and all these things? And is there a match or a mismatch between the skills young people have or can quickly acquire and what are needed? It's a big problem in America, for example. In spite of this horrible economy and everybody wanting a job, we are actually filling posted job openings. That is, employers say, I want to hire someone to do this, okay? Those jobs are being filled at only half the rate of previous periods after a recession. If we were filling jobs at the regular rate, there would be at least 2 million more people in the workforce. There are almost 4 million posted job openings on any given day in America, and they're not being filled in an appropriate way. What does that tell you? There's a skills mismatch. So if I were you, in your current academic discipline, I would ask myself, you know, those questions. Is there a skills mismatch? Is there a population problem? That is, am I creating more young people than we'll ever be able to create jobs for? And is there a national economic strategy that has enough labor-intensive sectors that will be able to create jobs for people up and down the line? And then you come up with a strategy, and then you need to execute it for about 5 years. And I think you can do it. I mean, and I could give you lots of examples. But with two different political systems. Rwanda, where I was, you know, had a terrible genocide and lost 10% of its people in 90 days in 1994. In 1998, their per capita income was still only $268 a year, less than $1 a day. Nobody had a job, right? In 2010, it was $1,300. They had increased their income 5-fold. And they had a strategy to do it that looked more or less like the one I just described to you. They knew they had to have more people in tourism. They moved aggressively to protect their gorillas and their natural resources so they could get more tourism while they were building up industry, building up their energy sources, building up their education sources. They had a labor-intensive strategy, and they had a modernization strategy. Vietnam, very different country. In 1995, when the United States normalized relations with Vietnam and basically reconciled with a country we fought a long war with, their income was $300 a year. In 2010, I went back at the invitation of the Vietnamese government to celebrate the 15th anniversary of our friendship. Their income was $1,500 a year. Five-fold increase in only 15 years. And they had, in a very different way, a strategy that fit their country. So I think my first question to you is, if you ask every person in this room, what's your country's economic strategy, can you give me an answer? And if not, the university should supply it. It ought to be a question on every test in every economics and business class taught. What should Cyprus's economic strategy be, and how would we implement it?
Thank you, Mr. President. The second question is posed by Marios Papanikolaou, a BA economics student. Thank you, Mario. The expansionary monetary policy after 2001 was in part to blame for the subprime mortgage crisis that still troubles the world economy. Now we see the USA, through the Federal Reserve, is attempting to quick start the world economy into shape through further quantitative easing. How far do you think this attempt will be effective?
I don't think it'll be very effective because you can't make interest rates any lower than they are. And I think, neither, by the way, do I think sustained austerity is likely to be effective either. Because the only way, what you get out of, when austerity works for a government to boost the economy was if you're in a circumstance like I was. In 1993, I decided that America had to do something serious about our debts. Why? Because for 12 years before I took office, we had been told that government was bad, taxes were bad, and if you just cut taxes enough, particularly on high-income people, all the problems of the world would be solved. So for the first time in the history of our country, we ran large, structural, permanent government deficits, not to invest in new technologies and infrastructure, but just to pay the bills, because taxes were bad and low taxes meant prosperity all around. What happened? We quadrupled the debt of the country, we drastically increased income inequality, and poverty went up even though growth seemed to be occurring. So I said, you know, this is a nutty thing. So we're going to have modest tax increases, we're going to cut spending, but we're still going to invest in education and infrastructure. And we cut the debt, and eventually my last 4 budgets were surplus budgets. That worked like a charm. Why? Because it drove interest rates down so much that the private sector borrowed money and invested like crazy and created jobs, and ordinary citizens had another $2,000 per family in their pocket in lower interest rates for cars and homes and consumer bills and college loans, and the economy grew from the bottom up as well as from the top down. But if interest rates are already zero, then if you cut spending, almost inevitably in the short run, revenues will go down even more than spending is cut. So it's like a cat chasing its tail. Now, it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some longer-term structural adjustments. For example, Greece has a tax compliance issue. And you can't have a country if a taxi cab driver in Athens or a fisherman in the Aegean feels like a chump if he pays taxes because he thinks people with higher incomes don't. On the other hand, what Europe really needs and what America really needs is a long-term plan to deal with the accumulated debt problems, and a short-term investment to put people to work and to create some economic growth now so that we can all start producing again. If we had growth, you would have no problem convincing every country in Europe to reduce its budget deficits, because interest rates would rise so fast no one could afford to borrow money. And the private sector would demand that it be done because their interest rates would be too high as well. But no, I don't think quantitative easing, another round of it, will help very much. The reason it worked the first time a little bit is that it dovetailed with what was being done in the Congress in 2009 and 2010 to incentivize new investment and new jobs. And you had cheap money, and there was no danger of a housing boom because it was gone because of what had happened, as you pointed out. So I think, for example, if the Federal Reserve could do it, they'd be better off buying the development bonds. This would be the equivalent of the Euro bond proposal for the EU. If the Federal Reserve were to buy development bonds which are secured by a revenue stream in America of our local governments, our state and municipal governments, they could finance more of these infrastructure projects in ways that would be considered financially sound. You could buy a one-year Treasury note last week for 1/4%, which means you could borrow $1 million for $250 for a year. It's like people, that's below inflation. It's like somebody saying, we will pay the U.S. Treasury to take our money because we're worried. German rates are even lower. So for whatever it's worth, I'm sympathetic with the people who say we have to deal with the long-term liabilities. But if you deal with them too soon, you just get more behind, because every time you cut spending, revenues drop more than you can cut spending. On the other hand, investors who want to see some long-term financial discipline are legitimate to want it. So what I would do, if I could wave a magic wand, is have the US and the EU, either collectively or its individual countries, adopt pretty strong 10-year budget plans that would bring down the debt and deal with the imbalances, but I wouldn't have them begin until somewhere toward the end of next year. I would phase them in, and then I would have a Euro bond and an American equivalent in the short run to put people back to work. Because once you did that and you created economic activity, then you get interest rates out of the zero range for the strong countries, and you'd create pressure to bring the deficits down because people were going back to work.
Thank you. The third question is from our business student, Nadira Slamova. Nadira? Okay, great. She's up there in the corner.
Oh, okay.
We seem to have booms and busts in the world economy at regular intervals. And as Rogoff and Reinhardt suggest, quote, history dictates that these crises share essentially the same characteristics. Nadira asks, how far is the financial crisis due to politicians not learning lessons from the past? And what can we do differently in the future?
Well, I think to some extent it's due to politicians not learning the lessons of the past, and maybe central bankers acting too much like politicians. But we know that all markets tend to self-destruct, and therefore capitalism has to be saved from itself by operating within limits. It's a question of balance. And when you're riding an escalator up, you always say, yes, I agree with that, but not yet. We're just making too much money here. What should have been a dead giveaway for the United States was when we had all this nominal growth but it was all in housing, finance, and consumer spending, and no jobs were produced. For example, a lot of you would have no reason to think about this, but you know, I lived through it, so I know. In the 7 years and 8 months of the previous decade, before the financial collapse began with the failure of Lehman Brothers in the US, okay, which ended the presidential race, ensured that President Obama would win, and all that. But in the 7 years and 8 months before that, our economy in the US had produced only 2.6 million private sector jobs, compared with 22.7 million in the 8 years before that when I served. Why? Well, there were a lot of reasons, but if you run a big open economy in a trading system world, and you want to continue to trade with others, you must have a source of new employment every 5 to 8 years. Consider the Germans. About a month ago, Germany produced 66 gigawatts of electricity from solar power. The first country ever to do that. And the sun in Germany shines on average as much as it does in London, not Cyprus. So they had to subsidize the daylights out of the solar industry. And they had to ask their people to pay more. But Deutsche Bank's analysis was that the Germans still came out ahead, netted 300,000 new jobs for doing it. So the United States had no new job source. So more and more money went into finance, which by definition can only employ so many people, right? It's an intermediary function. Went into housing, which is self-limiting and leads to bubbles, as you said. And went into consumer spending, but that was, for Americans, people overspending on their credit cards. They were spending more money than they could pay back in the required time. So we had imbalances. That when President Obama started providing employment-related incentives, and the Congress did, 2009, 2010, through the middle of this year, even accounting for the slowdown, we had 4.5 million jobs, private sector jobs, in 30 months. Not enough for us. To get back to full employment, we need 250,000 to 300,000 jobs a month for 3 years or so, and that's 150,000 jobs. But we were getting there, and then the American people elected an austerity-first Congress, knowing the EU unemployment rate was 3% higher than ours, and they stopped helping our local governments keep their police officers and teachers and firefighters and others on the payroll. So we lost 700,000 jobs in public sector that had to be subtracted from the 4.5 million we got in the private sector. But that's 150,000 jobs a month. And before the meltdown, we were producing less than 30,000 jobs a month. That should have been a dead giveaway. That's how you know you need the government to step in and limit excesses. When you have nominal growth, the stock market's growing, but nobody gets a job. That tells you there's just too much money being changing hands without any investment that will create opportunity for the broad mass of people. And that's what you should watch everywhere else. It's not just growth, but does growth translate into employment? If it doesn't, sooner or later you're going to have these imbalances just come up and hit you upside the head. You can't escape a bad outcome if you have years of nominal growth but no employment growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.